Anyway, so at the end of last class, I had said that I would check in to see if anybody wanted to share, right? Because we had worked last time on this thing, also like, sorry to say it, we were still on that first point of the four parting from the four attachments. We had worked specifically on, what's the word? Experimenting or playing behaviorally with, right? Reversing our attitude, right? And taking a different, taking an approach that's based on the opposite attitude, right? Rather than grasping, kind of letting go. So anybody want to share any experiment and any inner experiment?
Yeah, mine was to not Facebook and drive. So Gabe suggested putting my phone in the trunk, so when I drove away last week I put my phone in the trunk. In the first 3 minutes I'm like, this is great, I'm free, I feel so great. And I realized that I felt great because the temptation wasn't there, right? It was completely removed. So then I rationalized, well, I should have the temptation closer so I could really experiment with the feeling. And so I did that. It kept getting closer and closer all week. But I noticed that it's very uncomfortable. The wanting is so uncomfortable, but the issue that happens, as the week wore on, is I lose faith that I can get the feeling of freedom without eliminating it entirely. Does that make sense? So, the only way I can imagine having the freedom that I had the first 3 minutes is to completely eliminate the phone from the car, and I don't know if that is, I don't think that was the point of the exercise. I think the point is to get to a point where you feel liberated without having to remove the temptation, right? I don't know. So that's what I've been pondering on.
So what was your experience like as you moved it closer?
More uncomfortable. And near the end too, I didn't open the Facebook, but it's well, a text is not a problem, and I'm at a stoplight, or I'm looking for this email about this job I'm wanting, and I'm at a stoplight, so it's okay, and the rationalizations got quicker. And then the problem that the thing I was working with was really the compulsion. Things happened before I could think them out, and as the phone got closer, it was harder for me to slow down that process.
So I don't have an answer for you, but it's a great example of working with something in a real way, right? And really feeling. And to me, I'll just start with this. One immediate benefit from is I'll say from a Buddhist point of view, but also from the point of view of what we were talking about last time, is just experimenting with different distances. You gained more awareness already, right? In other words, there was that feeling of freedom, and then there was the feeling of temptation, and part of it is just the wisdom of watching your own mind, right? And so doing these experiments, whatever you're doing, right? If you're doing those kind of experiments, a big part of the purpose is just to watch and see, oh wow, look what my mind is like. If I do this, it's like that. If I do this, it's like that. And just having in other words, it's your own direct experience, so it's useful, right? And then you're seeing the suffering that comes with the craving, right? And then and actually, it's, as you described it very eloquently, it's there are all kinds of suffering, right? There's the suffering of wanting and sort of that agitated feeling, and then there's when you use the word rationalization, it means that there's a feeling afterwards of I rationalize, right? Which is not a comfortable feeling to have about oneself. It's an uncomfortable feeling to have, right? In other words, because we know that, right? In other words, we all do that at times, and then when you feel, oh, I just rationalized, right? It's somewhere in your conscience is some kind of discomfort, actually, right? And actually sometimes what Lama Zopa Rinpoche points out, he'll say sometimes we live our whole life with that feeling, and then we even die with that feeling. Not about this in particular, but in general, right? If we spend our lives rationalizing, then somewhere in the back of our mind we don't feel so good about ourselves our whole life, and then you even come to die, and your whole life you didn't feel good. Like he says, you watch a person their whole life they didn't feel good about themselves, and that's not a good feeling, right? So all those are real feelings, is my point. So you can see beforehand there's this feeling of wanting, then there's the feeling of excitement, right? Just what we talked about, right? The feeling of excitement of doing something that you were craving, and then there's this feeling, a bad feeling after. And actually even the excitement is not, if you actually analyze it, which is what these kinds of experiments do, right? Is then you really watch, wow, I'm feeling agitated, I'm craving, then there's this kind of excited but uncomfortable feeling, and then there's a bad feeling about myself, and that's flowing throughout my day, or it's it's a substratum of emotion during my day. And that's the purpose, right? And then we're learning. And I want to say too, so then there are many techniques in Buddhism, so it's up to the person and what one wants to do, right? But I'll say this too, like, so in, because the first step is that awareness, right? In other words, we have to have that awareness experientially. It can't just be theoretical, but by doing these experiments, that's what our goal was, right? Is that they come up in a much more visceral way and you see it. So then one has to judge for oneself. In other words, it's not a formula, right? I mean, there are many options, that's my point. But I want to say, like, if you think about in Buddha, so, I'm going to say this right, like, I guess then one has to judge. My point is then one has to judge for oneself, one's own capacity. Does that make sense? With anything, right? So like, there is, because nobody can say to you, you need to do, like, oh, somebody can, but you don't have to listen, right? And even if you do listen, it doesn't work if it's somebody else. Somebody says, I'm going to, I don't know, scream at you if you do this. That's not training your own mind. That's whatever. That's fear out of somebody else's punishment. That's not what we're talking about, right? So the idea would be, wisdom actually in this case, would be judging for oneself, right, in these kind of things, well, what am I capable of, right? Through one's own experience, you can see what your mind is like, right? And then if you want to be free, the goal is not about, in this case, right, the goal is not about Facebook, right, or text. The goal is to feel free in one's own mind, right? And to feel that sense of liberation and what's the word, peace of mind, actually, right? And so then one says, okay, if the goal, like Dalai Lama says, right, he often says, the goal is to be happy. Right? So if the goal is to be happy, which means having peace of mind, then one judges for oneself, well, what's a practical, based on the real analysis of my own experience, then you can judge better, what am I capable of? In other words, so one person might say, you know what, like I can contemplate, I can feel free, and I feel total peace of mind, I can have the phone, right here in my pocket, no big deal, right? Somebody else might say I need to smash my phone, with a hammer, and somebody else might say I need to keep it in the trunk, most of the time or something. But the key is whatever one does, it should be something that actually brings a feeling of peace of mind. You see what I mean? And then also like the level of what one can do changes over time, right? So like you have to keep checking. And once you come up with one solution, that doesn't mean it's a permanent solution either. Right? But one says, well, if I do this for a while, then I have peace of mind. Great, I'm going to do that for a while. And then I'll check in again, whenever. And I guess I want to point out, like, if you think about in Buddhism, like, because we all see images, right? The lamas are wearing robes, right? They're monks, nuns, things like that. Not all lamas, but many are. Right? Actually, those are just vows, right? Because there is in many cases, right? Why did the Buddha teach vows? Actually, he was teaching at this level of practice. What he was talking about was, like, people have so much craving, right? And so, if you think about it, what was the practical reason the Buddha taught vows? He was saying, like, they can't have peace of mind. Like, he was looking at ordinary people and he was saying, you all at that point, because he was already enlightened, he said, y'all don't have peace of mind, so here's a way of having peace of mind. Take a vow of not having wealth, right? And then you won't worry about wealth. You see what I mean? Like, and so so monks, for example, take a vow, right, not to accumulate stuff. And if they take that vow and they become at peace with it, well, then it's not an issue anymore, right? Obviously then, there are trainings in the Bodhisattva training where a person then, there could be, for example, examples where a time where a person will say, well, then they have to accumulate wealth to help somebody. Well, that's not a problem because they're not attached to it. You see what I mean? Like, the point is judging for oneself. Does that make sense? Or it's not like wealth is inherently bad. That's not what the Buddha was saying. What the Buddha was saying is attachment. That feeling that you were having for the Facebook, if one relates to money in that way, then that's a problem, right? And one suffers. If at a different stage of one's inner development, one sort of relates to money a different way, then that's a different issue. Or Facebook or anything else, whatever it would be, or any object, right? Because the issue is not the object, it's one's relationship to that object of craving and of grasping that always leads to this feeling of agitation beforehand, not entire satisfaction while having contact and then a bad feeling after. That's not, whereas one will never have happiness if one relates to anything in that way. And what Buddhism, actually, if you think about it this way too, like, why did, like, there are many stories of yogis, like Milarepa, who went off to caves, right, in Tibet. In India, they didn't know, I guess sometimes they went to caves, or sometimes to huts, or sometimes to, when Lama lived under a tree, like, why do they go to that extreme? Actually, it's not that there's particularly, actually, even the Lamas themselves will say, well, what's it called? Rats live in caves also. It's not something special about a cave, right? Like, Whereas a rat could live in a cave for many years, it's not getting enlightened from it, or under a tree or whatever. Like a bird can, whatever. A squirrel lives under a tree and it's not getting enlightened. The point is it's the same training we're doing in a different way, right? In other words, they're saying, actually, they're only living in a cave because they realize they have attachment to something else, and so they're running away to say, I want peace of mind. And once they achieve a level of peace of mind where they can be around things, they come back and be around things again. But actually, what the recognition is that you can't help yourself or others if you're feeling that agitated feeling, right? You're not available to help others, actually. And you're not available to have peace of mind yourself if you're in that state. And what really, if you think about one way of looking at this level of, or this part of the Buddha's teaching, is what the Buddha is really saying is know your own mind, and that you have responsibility, actually, right? That you're responsible for yourself to judge your level. But I guess what the Buddha is also saying is, if you want to be happy, then you have to adjust your environment to your level, right? And that's a sacrifice at times. It feels like a sacrifice, but actually it's not. Whereas it feels like a sacrifice because you're used to something, but actually it's giving you peace. You see what I mean? Like, the goal is to have peace of mind and a sense of contentment. That's the word I would use, contentment. So we have to judge for ourselves that thing. But does that make sense? Like, and so that's the issue. Even like if you think about like vows, actually, this is the point of vows to a large extent, right? Otherwise a vow doesn't have much meaning, right? But a vow has a lot of meaning if you're recognizing. There are different other ways to benefit with vows too, actually. So it's not that there's no meaning. There are other benefits too, but this is actually one huge benefit to that. In other words, is one makes a vow to, actually it's ultimately, whether it's to oneself or to the Buddha, this is causing me suffering, so I'm going to vow to stop suffering by doing, by changing my relationship to that. And that's actually in the four powers of purification. One makes I'm talking about that. I'm not talking about monks' vows now. I'm talking about in the four powers of purification, you make a vow, sometimes, to yourself or to the Buddha, to say, well, for this long I won't do this action. Okay? I'm talking about that kind of vow, right? Where it's not. There are other vows that came from the Buddha that are like a tradition. In this case, I'm talking about that, where you make a vow that you say, I don't want to suffer, so I'm going to do this, or I'm not going to do this for this long. Does that make sense? It's actually, if it comes out of this contemplation of seeing how you're creating your own suffering, then it's an act of compassion, actually, right, to make that kind of vow. Does that make sense? Or so if you say, well, for a week I'm going to do this, or for a month I'm going to do this, it's actually an act of extreme compassion to do that. Does that kind of make sense to you? Anyway, other examples if you want to share, because I think it's great. These are any other examples of people who tried?
Well, I had committed to trying this out with my mom and my sister, but I actually really didn't talk to them this week. But I applied this technique to things that I was struggling with, situations and people, both. And I actually had just remarkable experience this week. I can't even articulate it exactly. And I guess things that I would sort of ruminate on or be anxious about or dwell on in an attachment way about these issues, it's like it was like 95% of that disappeared and was just replaced with a total acceptance of the situation and an observance of the reality of it and a peacefulness. And also, but I tried to look at their point of view about being right for a situation that maybe just I'm misunderstanding the reality of it and I'm wrong. So I looked at it in those ways that you had asked us to do. But then also, this is sort of, I don't want to go off track, but I also started doing EFT tapping on meridians, and I don't want to talk about that here, but what I wanted to say is I started combining that together and things that I had been stressed about, emotional stuff that's stuck in me, all this stuff just I still have a lot of work to do, but it's I had these miraculous experiences this week with a couple things that were really traumatic, going away. But in a very different way than I've had before, in a way that sort of unearthed a lot of leftover stuff, and there's probably still more there, but just the stuff that I've been holding on to for decades, just sort of unearthing and but not stressing me, just like, it's like almost like vomiting up of bad stuff, but like not being sick in the process, just getting it out and letting go of it. So it was just, I don't know. So I'm gonna keep working on those things together, actually. It's just working, so.
Well, sure. Again, first of all, notice. I mean, we can all notice, right? This sense of awareness. I mean, the common theme here, right, is it. For one, is it leads to an awareness, right? But the other, I just want to point out that actually both of you mentioned in very different ways. But it's, I think it's an important point, is that a lot of times, especially if we're struggling, because I asked you guys to pick an example of something, which you both did in different ways, is something that you're actually feeling, what's the word, an issue with, right? There is, you did it with people in your something where there's an emotional attachment there, yeah. And I guess what I would point out, this is a lot of people don't. I just noticed this. A lot of people we don't want to change our behavior, right? Oftentimes, in other words, we're stuck in a pattern, and we don't want to change it in a way. But then when you actually change the behavior, I think is because so much of what we do is contemplating and meditating, which is very important because it has to be with awareness, right? And that's cultivating the awareness. But actually, it's hugely powerful to change your behavior, right? Like, in other words, to actually act different is huge, and if somebody's like, let's say it. Actually, it's true, isn't it? Like, in other words, if you're meditating, right? Let's say you're meditating on compassion, right? And then somebody comes along and there's some issue, or there's some, or whether it's a thing or a person, and you're acting with either, selfishness or craving or jealousy or anger, right? I mean, that's what I say. Actually, first of all, we know in our heart, actually, that we're being hypocritical, right? It's not a good feeling, is it? Like, in other words, we know that. And also, like, I guess what I'm getting at is this, is if you're actually willing to act differently, right? Like, to whatever that thing is, to actually do the other behavior and then see, it's a fast way to feel what you described, right? A feeling of freedom, a feeling of like some kind of release, as you described it. You guys would use different words, but there's an actual experience that comes. And then it becomes interesting. I'll just say, like, so let's say you do that, right? So you try something and you feel a sense of freedom, right? But then part of your mind's going to say, oh, that was cool. Okay, now I'll go back to what I was doing before. And then to say, why? Like, why would I do that, right? And to ask yourself and to analyze, like, wow, so like I do this and I feel free, but then I go back to doing that, like, and what am I doing, right? Like, why would I do that? And if you ask it honestly and you analyze, it's usually, right, what? Like, it's actually a lack of compassion for yourself, right? In other words, it's a lack of taking care of yourself. Does that make sense? Like, you're not really being kind to yourself then, right? So if you try something, like you think about it, you meditate on it, and then you try a behavior, and if it works, if you feel a sense of release, right, or a sense of freedom, then you have to analyze, like, if you want to go back, right? It's like, well, why would I want to do that, actually? Like, what am I doing? And usually it's, like, what's there to say? We're habituated to something, and we're actually not being very kind to ourselves, right? And then to say, like, well, can I be kind to myself one more day? And two more, that's when those 4 powers of purification, that's what that is, actually. Is like, it's actually a practice of practicing kindness to myself, to say, can I change my behavior a little longer so that I feel a sense of peace, And the idea would be eventually you get more and more peace, right? Does that make sense, actually? I think it's an interesting, because actually, these behavioral changes, especially for us, I don't know, maybe it's different, I'm not really sure. That'd be different if for people who are like living in retreat, maybe they don't have that much behavior then, so it's not as important. Then it's more internal. But for us, right, like, what? How much time do people spend meditating, right? The vast majority of your time is spent interacting, right, with objects and with people, right? Whether it's with, coworkers or family members, or whether it's with objects like food and cars and computers, right? And so this is actually really powerful. Then is to be willing to experiment with your relationships to other sentient creatures, right? Not just humans, could include pets and animals in the neighborhood, and then also to objects, right? And if we're not willing to change that, then what are we doing, actually, right? Like, whereas, like, you know what I mean? Like, in other words, if we're not willing to experiment with trying to relate differently, then it seems to reflect a lack of compassion, actually, for ourselves, doesn't it? Because actually, this is real compassion for yourself. Actually, compassion, sometimes sometimes, you know, on a superficial level, we can say compassion for yourself is what? Is like getting a facial or, you know, a massage or something like that. And maybe in some cases that is. I'm not against those things at all, you know. But what Buddhism's saying is there's a deeper level of compassion for yourself, which is actually like recognizing, or is that real compassion means you analyze what's the cause of my suffering and eliminating it. Does that make sense? That's real compassion, means you look at the suffering, but you also look at the causes of your suffering. And here I'm not talking, you know, there are many deep psychological things in Buddhism about the ultimate cause of suffering is the, you know, grasping at the inherently existent self. I'm not talking about that now. I'm just talking about like, because that's like more, that's more for if you're in deep meditation, right? I'm saying it's like what causes my suffering day to day, and am I willing to change my relationship to something to make that less? Does that make sense? You know, and I think these examples are real, right? It's mostly, I mean, it's good that you guys each gave a different, you know, you talk more about an object and you talk more about people, because that's what it is, right? It's always either, you know, it's either our computer or other people, and usually, oftentimes, you know, sometimes it's both. Right. And any, one more example before we go on, and then we'll go to, then I want to cut
Before
short.
we go,
Yeah.
so does it start in terms of changing the habit patterns first with suppression of that particular emotion, and eventually leading it to control?
Actually, I think in a,
Because the suppression is kind of a temporary thing; it will keep coming back. I've quit smoking, so I know that.
yeah. The idea in, I think in, actually in if you think about the Buddhist approach, it actually, I mean, it actually doesn't emphasize suppression really. It's more what we were doing. So in other words, the idea would be that you're actually not trying to suppress it particularly. Occasionally you can by distracting yourself, right? It's not that that's wrong,
Exactly.
but that's not the ultimate
Like
solution.
putting the phone in the trunk, or you're not buying a cigarette, or going to a place where you're not allowed to smoke.
Yeah.
Is more of a externally driven control.
Right. And then what you have to, I guess what I'm pointing out, though, in Buddhism, you have to combine, this is why we have to, that's why I was emphasizing the awareness piece, too, is that in Buddhist practice, what's really seen as most useful is, just say this right, like, on the one hand, you know, it's useful for periods of time to separate yourself from the situation, but then, actually, you have to do what we were describing, which is then the meditation part, which is to bring up the feeling, right? Actually intentionally, but not, ideally not when you're, like for example, I don't know if you were here, like the time we did with the donut, right? We would hold the donut, right? Or like, I guess my point is that you would want to do it, sorry, say this, like this, like that you don't want to do it at a time where you're distracted by other things and are likely to get caught in the desire, right? So you would want to do it at a time where you're really going to meditate. And then you watch the desire arise. And then you do the contemplation we did last time, which is to look at it, because actually inside desire, this is the Buddhist insight in part, is that inside desire are a whole bunch of unrealistic views and thoughts that we don't analyze ordinarily, right? So if you're distracted, like let's say you're, you know, if somebody's trying to quit smoking and they're out, like for example, the worst time, you know, like, or if they're around friends who are smoking in a bar, right? You've lost, right? You're drinking, you're around other people smoking, people are talking to you, you're gonna, you know, it's the worst possible situation, right? On the other hand, it might be great, let's say you were in a retreat, right? So actually put a cigarette there and then analyze. Okay, what arises? You see what I mean? Or the same as we did with the donut, right? And watching what arises and saying, so then it's not suppression at all, it's actually to, but it's actually to look at that, and then, this is what the Dalai Lama, I was saying, always emphasizes, right? Is then you allow the desire to arise, but in this case, I would call, again, I'm going to use a phrase from emptiness meditation, which is not usually used in this context, but actually it's the object to be refuted. That's the object to be refuted through reason, right? So you actually allow the desire to arise, and then you analyze it. You say, wow, look at this. Actually, it's all suffering. Like you analyze how much suffering is there and how much unrealistic, right? This desire is implying that I'm going to be happy by having that, right? The feeling is I'll be happy, and yet I won't be happy. I've already had that, and every time I had it, then what happens, right? I'm feeling a little guilty, I'm feeling bad about myself, I'm worried about my health, I'm worried about what other people think of me, I'm worried about whatever the things would be, you know, and then afterwards I have all those other feelings, right? Like, you know, all these other feelings that we were talking about. And you actually keep analyzing that, but in Buddhism, the key is like, you know, so if you're out, I'm giving you an example, like if you're out somewhere at a party, right, then yes, avoid, you know, like it's fine to avoid. It's not that it's bad to avoid, but then you actually have to face the issue. but you face it. That's part of what meditation is for. Actually, is that so in the meditation you might put a cigarette there, right, and then you analyze. Wow, look at what happens, and you analyze like how much suffering actually, and if you really spend time, I'm talking, like if you did it for weeks, really meditating on it, then you come to a visceral experience of like where it actually feels like not just, it's not the object that's it's like my process is I mean like where you realize wow it's so much suffering actually, and then again you say okay, where am I at today externally? You say, I mean, so then you have to check in with you, okay, okay, maybe I still need to be at this level of behavioral thing, but the idea is if you keep meditating like that eventually you reach a point where the environmental stuff is less important. But we have to be honest with ourselves, because sometimes people can rationalize, to use your word, like that is a very good word, where we say, oh well, I'm past that, I'm cool, and and then we're in situations where we make problems for ourselves, right? And because we haven't really done the work of facing what goes on inside me, and where's the part that's not realistic, and do I really see that it's not realistic? I remember last time I said at the beginning, actually, again, this is not only an intellectual process, it's also a visceral, emotional process. And I was saying how like many times when we do this, at least I do, where like I'll intellectually see something, oh yeah, it's easy to see this is a cause of suffering, right? But emotionally, I still feel, the feeling is, no, I really want that, right? So I'm a beginner still on that point then, actually. Even if I intellectually understand it, on a real, on the level of behavior, I'm still a very beginner, I'm a pre-beginner or something. And then you start to have a doubt where it actually feels, well, I'm not so sure. And then eventually if you reach the level where you think, yeah, I don't want that at all. And I'll give an example, because we all have things we're attached to and things we're not, right? So, if somebody said, do you want, what's it called? What's that stuff called? Like some of those, there are like a few different drugs, right, that are so destructive, right? I was thinking of LSD, or I was thinking of somebody else, anyway, a crack or something like that. Right? Somebody says, oh, here, do you want some crack, right? Like immediately my feeling is, oh, like I have no interest in that, right? So if you get to that level with cigarettes, then then it's not a problem, right? But if you're not at that level, where it's a visceral, immediate experience, right? As soon as if I saw somebody shooting up heroin, my immediate response is, oh, wow, that's terrible. Like so much suffering, right? That's a visceral experience. But if somebody shows me donuts, my experience is not so much like that. It's not as quick. It's not as quick to feel, oh no, I'll suffer. And so that's the point, is we have to be honest with ourselves and check. And again, I'm not saying the donuts are bad. I'm just saying that we have to analyze our own experience and be honest, where are we at in terms of our own analysis of our relationship to the object. Does that make sense? But it has to be, but if you want to change that, so you have to do two things both at the same time. One is behaviorally change something so that you're giving yourself peace when you're busy and distracted, but then when you're not busy and distracted, you have time to meditate, then you meditate on that actually. You see what I mean? That's the important, you have to do both sides of this. Otherwise it doesn't really work, right? Otherwise what happens is you avoid something, you get a little peace, so that's good, but then you go back and then it gets triggered again and you don't make any real progress. But if you do the meditation part as well as the behavioral part, then you get more freedom, because you're free in the moment, because you have peace of mind like you did in the car. But then eventually through the meditation and analyzing, then you get peace. Then even when you're exposed to the object, you have peace still, right? So the idea is eventually just get peace of mind all the time, actually. Which doesn't mean you avoid complexity, actually. It means that if you change through the meditation to not be driven by desire, you can actually be in relationships more with things and people without getting as agitated, but that takes practice. And that's really the practice, is the meditation part. But the behavioral part is more to give ourselves peace of mind in the moment. And also, if you don't do that, right, then it's hard to meditate, right? Because then when you finally sit down to meditate, your mind is so agitated by all the things you've been doing all day, you actually can't analyze anything, because I was busy with this, and I was busy with that, and I was craving after this, and then this person did this to me, and then I did that to them, and then you sit down to meditate, and you can't even analyze anything, because your mind's so, it's like a pond that you stir up, and it's all clouded. There's not enough clarity even to analyze the thing. So there's a relationship also between the behavioral change, which is create a little bit more space, so that then when you meditate, you have enough peace of mind so you can actually analyze in a realistic way. So those actually go together. Yeah. Does that make sense also? Yeah, any other questions before we switch to...
Real quick, is it possible to like have a preference and like something and not be a cause of suffering, or is it that it agitates your mind and it becomes suffering?
Yeah, actually, there's a difference between liking something. I mean, actually, it's interesting to analyze. Again, we should check for ourselves in a way with experience, but check up. You know, it's an interesting question, right? You have to check experientially, right? Can I like this? And is that the same as attachment? Like, I don't think it's always the same, actually, personally. I think there's a difference between grasping, grasping at something, because actually, because if you think about it, like from Buddhist psychology's point of view, right, like, actually, feeling, which they, I mean, what they mean by that is a pleasant, neutral, or positive feeling. They call it an omnipresent mental factor. It means it's always there. So we always like, dislike, or feel neutral towards everything, actually, in any given second by second. That's always sort of there. There's a feeling tone in our experience of objects. You know, so you hear a certain sound, you immediately feel averse. Other sounds you barely notice and you don't care, and others you feel attracted, for example. And so that level of, that's like a, what's the word to say it? If you think of it that way, that this feeling of, oh, that's attractive to my, actually, I'll say it this way, like so people who have even bodhisattvas still have that because it's always there. So they're not attached and grasping, saying this will make me happy, exaggerating the quality of it. They may just notice, oh, that's pleasant, you know. But they don't have that same quality of going from, oh, that's pleasant, I enjoy that, which is fine. Actually, that's not suffering. But what becomes a suffering, or that's not causing more suffering. But then when the person starts grasping and saying, I want it always to be like that. Why is this person making this other noise? You know, I want to always hear that noise. And then like we buy the album and then we're disappointed. I don't like this other song, and then like whatever. Give an example. And then that's where it starts to create a suffering. So I don't think that the pleasant sensation, right, or sort of liking a particular thing, is the same as exaggerating the qualities of that thing, and then thinking it's going to make me happy, and then wanting it, and then being angry when I can't get it, and all that, and being.
So I was starting to think you can't enjoy anything because it says it's suffering. So okay, that's good.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just not. What we're really getting to is not exaggerating. That's really the key. Right, like it's interesting. I'll take the example of it. I picked sound because actually, when they teach that, they usually do it in the that they're the senses, right? And we can be attached to any sensory, like the sounds, smells, taste, touch, and ideas too. And right, but think of a song, right? Like there is this one experience where you just hear a song and say, "Wow, that's pretty," right? That's cool, or something, And then like there's not a sense of grasping, right? But then there comes the other experience, right, where you say, "Oh, I've got to own that song," right? And then you say, oh, I've got to find it, right? And then then you want to find it, and then you find it, right? And then you play it over and over again, right? Until eventually you're sick of it, right? And then you don't want to hear it anymore. That's the process of, like, where there's some kind of grasping that happens, and you watch your own mind, it's not a happy feeling, right? Like, whereas there's a sort of feeling like you're gradually getting sick of the song, but you still sort of like it, you're listening, and then eventually you get totally sick of it, and then you don't play that album for a long time, right? That's different from just noticing the song and enjoying it in the moment. So there's two different.
So, if you are in nature and you see something particularly spectacular, like beautiful setting, scene, and it may not only be the visual cue, but the vibratory energy that's there. So, I think, for me, I think, I look around this room and I'm happy every time I come here. But if I don't come here again, I'm not going to suffer about it. Like I'm not going to be sitting in my house thinking oh my God, I have to see this image, But yet I enjoy it tremendously when I'm here. But I don't consider that to be an unhealthy attachment. But it is a kind of attachment because I'm soaking in it and I'm really enjoying it, and I want to live longer and experience this longer. So I do feel there's some kind of attachment. But I guess I don't know. I don't know what point I'm trying to make here exactly, but I think that for those of us who are not completely attachment free, I think there may be a sort of a level or degree of for lack of a better understanding, a healthier attachment that's like, you could miss something, but not be suffering over it. Like, I could miss the view, like, I still have memories of places I've been to where I would love to see them again. I'm not suffering because I'm not seeing them again, but they were so spectacularly, like, magnificent, like, I just want to go back there and see that or experience that again, or go to a similar place. But I don't feel angst about not being there, or people that I love, that I'm attached to, but I don't know.
Yeah.
Like, I think it's okay to miss, right? It's okay, I mean, for the average person who's not enlightened, I think maybe,
Yeah, maybe, I guess what I want to just say is this, is like,
but it's still attachment.
because you guys are getting a similar point here. So, I mean, I'll just say this, like, the key here is not, like, what's there to say? There's, the key here is to watch your own experience and check for yourself, ultimately, right? In other words, and there are, I think, what I would say is actually the mind training teachings in Buddhism say this. They say, actually, there are so many things, right, actually, that we create a lot of suffering for ourselves with. You know, like, for example, the, whatever, you know, whether it's the examples you guys gave, and I'm sure everybody had examples last time, actually, right? So, what I would say is this, is actually what the mind training teachings say are start with the worst one. You know, so, in other words, if something's not, like, if you know, if you have like, if you have an appreciation of nature, and, well, good, actually, that's not a big problem, right? Maybe actually a good thing, or, you know, and I guess you can know, I can't judge for you, only you can judge for yourself. Is there some exaggeration there, or is it just a realistic appreciation? Actually, if it's realistic, then there's not a problem. You know, if there's some distortion, that's where the problem, if you're exaggerating, that's where the problems come. If you're exaggerating the quality of the thing and the happiness that will come from it. And what the mind training teachings say actually is this, is actually if you made a list, you would have tons of things that you distort. If you're an ordinary person, there are lots and lots of things that we distort and exaggerate that create a lot of suffering. And they say start with the worst and work, you know, so the ones that are subtle and that, you know, you're not sure if there's a slight attachment, but it seems, I would suggest don't worry about them. You know, let's start off worrying more about, or not worrying, but addressing the ones that create a lot of suffering, right? And where there's a lot of emotion and emotional agitation, because those are the ones that you're creating a lot of problems for yourself and also for other people and so on. And these other ones that are kind of like, you know, some of them may not even be exaggerated, or some might be very slight. You know, those should come at the end anyway. There is but start with the worst ones where you know, actually, because it's easier also. It's actually easier to see the suffering that comes in the worst. By worst, I just mean the ones that cause the most agitation in your mind. That's all I mean. Not worst in the sense of like some moral judgment, but worse in the sense that they create a lot of agitation. Yeah, so I wouldn't worry about that. Yeah, I agree with you. In other words, I wouldn't worry about the ones that don't seem to be creating. In other words, like, because again, it's not hard to find ones that create a lot of suffering. So we should focus on those anyway. And these other ones, you know, it might be that you're totally realistic anyway, and then it's not a problem at all. Or it might be if there's a slight attachment. Well, that you can worry about later. You know.
well, maybe we need to attach more. Like, I love my mother, but sometimes I feel like I should see her or pay more attention to her than I do. So maybe I need to attach more.
Yeah, well, and also I want to say too, like, this is an important point, like, that because I said this once before, when, he's not here, this other guy asked a question, like, is that, you know, there are forms of desire that are healthy, and Buddhism says are healthy. So it's not that Buddhism is saying all desire is unhealthy, right? Like, as we said, the desire to benefit others is a desire, right? But that's not an unhealthy desire. Like, whereas in and of itself, that's not. Now, if we say I want to desire others because I want them to like me, that becomes a problem, right? But if it's just I really want to be, you know, I want to cultivate love, right? That's a want, but that's not unhealthy, because there's a recognition love creates happiness. So not all desire is unhealthy. You said, or I want to, you know, I want to go see the sunset. That may not be unhealthy, actually. I don't know. It depends on the person, right? But the desires that are unhealthy are the ones where we're exaggerating something. Does that make sense? Where we're feeling, I'll be happy if I have that. That's a pure thing. If I could just have that, then I'll feel. And it's not an intellectual belief. There are thoughts there, but there's also a feeling component, right? And those are the ones where, in other words, where you're exaggerating the quality of the object, and there's a kind of almost there's actually a feeling that if I can have that, then I'll have happiness. If I don't have that, then I won't have happiness. That will bring me some kind of real deep happiness. That will bring some kind of permanent happiness. You know, we don't intellectualize about that, but that's the feeling. When you have that feeling, right, there's an exaggeration. And though any desire where there's an exaggeration is always going to cause suffering. That's the point. So you have to check for yourself if you're exaggerating in a given instance. Yeah, other questions? Comments?
I'm just picturing Homer Simpson with the donut, you know?
Yeah.
So action led by the, it's like without exaggeration, in reality, they are wholesome actions, and that's welcome.
Yeah.
But if actions like, if you can observe that feeling behind that actions is not comfortable or something, then somewhere within you itself it tells you that you need
Exactly.
to maybe step back and analyze it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Nagarjuna, the great Indian Buddhist, the greatest, after the Buddha, probably the most respected of all philosophers, right? He said, actions done with, actions done motivated by desire, but by me he meant this kind of desire we're talking about, exaggerated desire, anger, or ignorance, are the causes of all suffering. But he said a second half of that verse. He said, actions done with no free from desire, anger, or ignorance, lead to happiness, right? And so it's not saying don't do anything, and it's not saying don't feel anything. It's saying that with those exactly what you said, that with those distortions, then we create suffering. But he said the opposite too, right? He said if we do things free from those, then we create peace, actually, and happiness. So it's exactly right.
So if you do let's say like you do let's say like do everything, like let's say every day I do something, then then I set a motivation, does that become positive?
Yeah. So that.
Because I'm aware of the action, I say like I'm gonna do this for this. We know the action is negative, but I have a motivation, is that negative?
Like which negative? Give an example of what you mean.
Like I say, okay, I'm gonna buy a lottery ticket because I wanna win, because I want to use the money to do this and this.
Yeah.
But I have a motivation because I want to do this and this. So is that negative?
In that case, I think again one has to. I mean, only the person themselves can actually analyze, right? Like there is a. You have to check your own mind, right? Like in other words, if there's if the person really is feeling, what's there to say it? Because actually, the example you gave is great, right? Because it really means. I mean, again, because what's the right way to say this? The issue is being honest with oneself, right? In other words, if really there's a feeling of peace, okay, this is fun, like I'm buying it, but I want to give it all away, right? I read about a couple, like recently, in, Canada? It was an elderly couple, and I think the woman had cancer, and they actually won a lottery. They won, I don't know, some very large, and I think, what was it? Like they won hundreds of thousands of dollars, and I think they kept like $5,000, and they gave the rest away, to charities and to people they knew who were in need, and, and like, what a cool story. I was like, wow, what a beautiful, and they said, whatever, he had worked they weren't wealthy, they were, but he was like, I have a retirement, whatever, like pension or something, and we're okay, we're safe. And they had fun giving it all away, I remember reading, going, wow, what a beautiful story. So, on the one hand, you could look and say, wow, there was maybe they were buying it actually with that motivation. Deep in their heart, there was a feeling of, this is fun, right? You get the sense as I read that story, I thought, they were having fun buying it. It was sort of a game to them. And they really thought and felt, well, if we win, we want to give it away, and how fun that'll be. So they're actually pure, right? In other words, they had a pure motivation as they did this action, right? And then they happened to win and they gave it away, and they had so much fun watching other people be happy and sort of feeling they had this opportunity, they were fortunate to have the opportunity to make other people happy, and that was really winning, right? On the other hand, if somebody were to say I'll give it all away, but in one's heart one feels, well, I'll give half away. Well, after taxes, I'll give half away. If you start doing that, and then I'll do the taxes, and then I'll pay off this, and then I'll go on a vacation, and then I'll give half away. If you start doing that, right, if that's the process in your mind, then you're again creating suffering. Then you watch your own mind. Actually, it's only you can know that in your heart, right? Like in other words, so if I were to say, oh, that couple was doing that, I'd be totally wrong, right? They won and they did it, so you can't tell. Only the person themselves can tell what's in their own introspection. But if you're, so if a person can do it within their heart, sort of enjoy it, there was those people weren't exaggerating. They were having fun. It looked to me like they were some couple who were having fun playing it and watching the outcome. And then they thought, if we lose, we had fun, and if we win, we get to help others. This is fun. That would seem like a very pure enjoyment. Whereas if somebody were in their mind were thinking, you know, I want to win. Oh, then I'll do this. You know, then there's some feeling like, oh, I lost, darn, right? You know, like, you know, then that's like suffering, actually. And so it's clear for oneself, but only the person himself can judge that. Does that make sense? So it's really one, and again, because this is the issue of happiness versus suffering, so you have to check your own mind and see if there's some suffering that's going on in it, then it's not. If you're creating suffering through that process, then you're creating suffering for yourself, and nobody else can, only you can know that, and then only you can fix it, too, you know. And then it's also up to you. Can I make a pure motivation, or do I have to stop buying lottery? Again, only that person can tell, right? Like, one person might be able to say, well, I could meditate and purify my motivation. They really can. Somebody else, they're still grasping, and there's like a real gambler mind there. Then they have to stop, right? So it depends on that person. Only you can, but you have to be honest with yourself. And the way you can tell if you're being honest with yourself is, am I happier, right? If you say I'm, like, through my contemplation, through my analysis, and through my changing behavior, I'm becoming more and more happy and peaceful, then you know you're doing it right? If you say you're doing this, but then you look back in 3 months, 6 months, whatever, and you say, well, I'm not really any happier, then that means you haven't been honest in your own assessment, that you're tricking yourself somehow. You know, and we all do that at times, but that's the way to check, right? And it doesn't mean, you know, nobody becomes enlightened overnight, right? It is just a long, difficult process, but complicated process. But we can all say, you know, am I a little more peaceful? Right? And if I'm not, then that means I'm not being honest, or I'm not addressing something that's causing me mental agitation, and I need to address it, otherwise I won't get happiness. That's all. Like, so that's the way to check, is that, yeah.
So sometimes sometimes it can be like needle, sometimes like, it's two sets of mind, it seems like two sets of mind,
Yeah.
they're convinced about this, they're convinced, then,
And I guess I'll say, remember last time I said, though, like, about doubt, that's a progress, actually, right? We start with wrong view, and then we get to, like, doubt in the wrong direction, then middle doubt, then doubt in the right direction, then eventually we come to, like, a correct idea, and then eventually we come to a visceral, real experience of the correct truth about this particular thing. And so, you know, if you're having two minds, that means, actually, at least you're not at the total wrong. You know, for example, there's some people who would say, like, I'll pick the example of gambling, right? Because the gambling, right? There's some people who say, like, it's great. When can I get back? I want to go. You know, I'm going. Like, you know, all I care about is I want to, you know, save enough money so I can get back to Vegas and do, you know, right? And that's all that, you know. So that'd be completely thinking, you know, and that I'm talking about, like, in a real addicted, like a, you know, I want to do this. Like, that would just be completely wrong, right? I'm just using the metaphor or the example of buying a lottery thing. If a person's somewhere in the middle where they say, well, I'm kind of creating suffering, but I'd like to give some to charity, you know, something like that. Well, at least they're doubting, you know, so that's progress, but they have a long way to go still in their contemplation. So you have to so the point is, if you just stop there, that's not helpful. But if you have a doubt on a particular issue, keep meditating on it, and eventually you'll keep progressing, right? So eventually sort of at least having more, well, probably it's more like this, you know, or something, and you keep going. But only you can, it takes your own honest observation of your own process, right? Honestly looking at what happens for me, what happens for other people, how do I relate to this, how do people like me relate to this, what happens in the long run. You have to keep doing that over and over, because it doesn't happen otherwise, unless it takes repetition. Yeah.
So life is all about observation?
You know, I think it's both. Like, there is I mean, ultimately, actually, like, you know, I should say too. Actually, like, so we've been going through this. Actually, we haven't really been going through it. We started with this thing that there's a very short, just it's like one verse with 4 lines, right? Called "Departing from the 4 Attachments." That was what we started with. So even though there's a 4th class, we're still in the first verse. And so that verse really was about, because what we realized was that that's like the hardest one in some ways to do, right? Which is, how do you overcome this? How do you overcome these grasping things, right? And so so for that level of, like, to overcome that, which is the main and the reason we stayed with it, I think, is that there was a recognition that that's what causes, for ordinary people, that's what causes the most suffering, actually, right? Is that we do this process of exaggerating, either anger, right, we're exaggerating the negative, or attachment, the grasping attachment, we're exaggerating the positive, and then we behave based on that. You know, like, we act out based on that, that's how we cause most of our suffering on a day-to-day level. So to change that, of course, one has to analyze, actually, right? One has to look at that and analyze it and see what's happening. And then also one has to change one's behavior too, ultimately, right? If we're causing if we're doing behaviors that are causing, problems, then we have to try our best to change those also. But actually, in the context of those parting from the four attachments, the third attachment is relates to compassion, actually, which is then becomes actually still one has to start off with analysis, but ultimately it should lead to actually acting to benefit others, for example. Right? I guess part of what this particular teaching is sort of recognizing, though, and actually it says it in some of the commentaries, it points this out, that if one doesn't do this work, right, Dragpa Gyaltsen, who wrote the commentary on this, he says if one doesn't do this level of analysis and of change of one's attitude, then if one starts to sort of try to work to benefit others, if one hasn't gotten past this level of stuff to some extent at least, then one just makes that into another version of attachment. Like, where he gives the example, he says, so somebody acts to benefit others, but then what's mainly in their mind is, are you noticing how great I am? Oh, I'm doing so much. Doesn't everybody think I'm so wonderful? He gives the example, and he says, well, then that's not spiritual practice yet. That's not spiritual. That's just what's the word? Advertising or something. It's like an advertising campaign for one's ego. But if one gets past that, then the job is to help others. Of course, that's the main task here. So these are just like almost clearing the ground so that one can. Actually, this is just a preliminary level. These analyses are actually preliminary, so that one can create the space in which to be of benefit to others. Really.
Like Campbell says, you become an instrument of something higher purposes going through you instead of you're acting your own whims and
Yeah, exactly.
fantasies and things.
Yeah, so these are to get those things out of the way so that we can have space for them. Yeah.
Can you speak to the difference between, compassion is always healthy, but for example, one source of suffering for myself, and I believe most other people, is the suffering of others causes me suffering. Observing or witnessing in any way, shape, or form the suffering of others is a major cause of suffering in me. So, and I think that's true for most sentient beings that have some sense of compassion. So, but for example, like there are times, to give a more concrete example, like there are times that I felt in my life, my mother will call me up, are you sick, or whatever. Like she has this little ESP thing going on, so she knows when I'm sick, and then of course I try to lie because it irritates me, because I'm like, no, I'm not sick, I'm like, but she'll know sometimes, and what I find is that sometimes her care and love and concern for me makes me feel like, not lately, but in the past has made me feel a little bit smothered. So I do see a distinction, and I know that I can be at times in my life, not as much, attached to overly concerned about someone else's suffering, which I think it actually is healthy, but I think there's a difference between compassion and like an attached sort of over-exaggerated concern for someone else's suffering. I don't know, do you see what I'm trying, maybe I'm not articulating it properly, but...
Yeah, I guess I'll say I'll just say a few comments, and I'm not sure if it'll be helpful or not, but it can't hurt to try. One is that right, like compassion is in Buddhist psychology actually I'll just start with the definition. First of all, there are different kinds of love and actually there are different kinds of compassion too. The different Buddhism actually is amazing. It has huge categories for these things like love and we don't have we have compound words. They have so like one is like sometimes called like love, affectionate love, I'll call it, right, which is a feeling of warmth, of like warmth and affection towards others, right, and that's different from I would call it altruistic love, which is the wish that others be happy. They're related but slightly different states of mind. Like one is sort of that warm feeling, and usually that leads to the second one, which is that wish that others be happy. And then on a basic level, compassion is defined as the wish that others be free from suffering. Right? So you have to face somebody suffering to have compassion for them. And then there are many levels of compassion, though, and descriptions of it. But I guess what I want to say are two things. Like, one is, I think there are two parts to it, answer your question. One is why this, what we were getting at in discussing your comment, which is that that's one reason why one has to first work, in other words, to have effective compassion. Actually, in Buddhism, if you look at the what's the word, sequence of meditations, these come first, right? These ones about working through craving, attachment, working through extreme, these extreme sort of causes of mental agitation. And then, actually, before one really meditates on compassion, one develops a sense of equanimity. Actually, that always comes first. In the two methods for generating bodhicitta, one actually first meditates on even-mindedness or equanimity, which means actually cultivating a mind that cherishes all others equally, or cultivating a mind that recognizes that all others are equally worthy of love and equally worthy of compassion. Because if one doesn't do that, then the insight that Buddhist psychology has, is that otherwise one ends up creating a lot of suffering. Actually, in other words, there's like, and I was going to say this, like, actually, like, gangsters have compassion, actually, right? Everybody has some compassion for somebody, So, I mean, gangsters have compassion for their own kid, let's say, right? Oftentimes. And therefore might kill somebody, right? Who offended their kid. That's not what Buddhism's aiming at, right? There is or what's I say this? So where there's like too much focus on one and then a neglecting of other. The point, though, what I'm getting at really is this: is there was a recognition in Buddhism. There's a metaphor for this. What was it? Oh yeah, because this is a Tibetan metaphor. You can tell it didn't come from India, right? That if you don't develop even-mindedness, it's like trying to collect water in a Rocky Mountain cliff. In other words, it runs off all the time, right? In other words, that if your mind isn't even, then when you try to, the metaphor is, if you try to collect the water of compassion on a jagged cliff, it keeps running away. It just flows away. Whereas if you can create that even-minded space, then the water of compassion can become an ocean, is the metaphor, a lake or something. And the metaphor they're getting at is this, so if, let's say, I have a lot of grasping at somebody, and then I also do have compassion for them, right? But I also have attachment grasping at them as mine. Like, this is my friend, I want my friend to be happy, I don't care about other people, right? And then what happens is, there is some compassion, there's a moment of compassion there, but if I have compassion for my friend, right? Then what starts to happen is then I have compassion for my friend, then this person is creating problems for my friend, I don't like that person, right? I actually dislike that person, I'm angry at them, but I'm compassionate towards my friend. Then my friend is like complaining that they're not happy, right? Then I might even get annoyed at my friend. I wanted you to be happy. Why aren't you happy already? Because I want to be happy. And I'm not happy if you're not happy, so you better get happy already. And also, this person better shut up. And at that point, one is no longer in a state of compassion, actually, right? One is in a state of anger and agitation. So that's the problem if one doesn't develop even-mindedness. You see, but if a person develops even-mindedness first, right, which is compassion and love, creating the ground for compassion and love for all beings, right? Then, like, somebody comes and says, then my friend is suffering, and he comes and says, this person created a lot of suffering for me, right? Like, then what happens is actually, first of all, I feel compassion for my friend and for that person, right? Like, that person's actually suffering worse than my friend. And almost you could feel more compassion for the person creating the suffering, if anything. Like, wow, like, my friend is suffering, but this person's really suffering. They're, going around making a lot of problems, actually. Poor person, so you're not agitated in that sense, right? And then, like, when my friend isn't happy, right, if there's not an ego agenda, like if it's sort of like, you're mine and I need you to be happy so I can be, then it's like a narcissistic relationship in a way, if I feel that towards my friend, right? Then I'm going to start getting agitated, But if it's not that, if it's just love and compassion, then the more they suffer, actually, the more I'll feel compassion. It's not going to be like, I'm not having an ego agenda of, you better be happy for my sake. But it'll be like a feeling of, wow, the suffering's going on, this person isn't getting out of it, and there's actually the compassion gets deeper as the suffering goes on. So it's not like, I need you to be healthy for me, or happy for me, or rich for me, or whatever that would be. It's like, whatever your suffering is, I can be with you just, and then that leads to one next phase, actually, of compassion, which is ultimately in Buddhism, compassion needs to be joined with wisdom, which is a whole other level, right? And that's where, like, wisdom in part means that the person can see the cause, not just the suffering, but the causes of the suffering, right? Wisdom means you understand the process of how things develop, you see? And so then, like, a person comes and they're suffering, right? And I understand, like, different levels of how what the causes of suffering are, right? And so then, if you have that level of wisdom, what's the way to say this? You know, then there's compassion wanting to free the other person, but there's also a recognition of, what's the way to say this? Like, that they're not going to be free from the suffering until they can get rid of the causes of that particular suffering. And so there's not as much agitation. Instead, there's just a feeling of, like, I'll do what I can to help them eliminate either to comfort them if that's all I can do, or if I can help them to eliminate the causes of suffering, then I'll help them. But if I can't help them, if there's some reason, like, you know, there's no way, like, you know, it's like this, like, you know, if I know that the weeds are hurting these crops, but I'm not allowed to pick those weeds because I'll be, whatever, because the farmer will shoot me, well then, all I can do is, you know, I can write a letter and say, by the way, if you get rid of the weeds, that's all I can do, right? Like, I can't force them. It's a bit like that, and there is, so the point is that if you can conjoin your, first with equanimity, and then later with wisdom, then one's compassion, first of all, becomes stronger and more lasting. It doesn't rush away like on the mountain cliff. But the other is that then it actually gives, like the Dalai Lama often says this, because it actually has to come with the equanimity though, and with the wisdom eventually, is then compassion doesn't, what's the way to say it? Then rather than just causing suffering, right? Because if you don't understand the causes, then it can just be like agony, right? If you feel like everybody's suffering but there's nothing to do about it, right? Well, then it can be a kind of feeling of hopelessness. But if you have the wisdom understanding the causes of suffering and understanding the long-term perspective, right? And understanding what one can do, what the Dalai Lama says is then it actually gives rise to a feeling actually of bravery and confidence, compassion, right? Where you feel, yes, I can't fix everything right now, of course, that's obvious. You know, things are very complicated. But with compassion, I'll do what I can. And today I'll do what I can, tomorrow I'll do what I can. And I know, because I understand the causes, that even if it's not getting better right away, I'm doing the right things, and so eventually that will bring some good results for those. You know, I'm doing everything I can to bring some good results, so there will be some good results. And it brings a confidence to keep working at that. And then one sees little results, you know, a little bit, and builds more and more confidence. And so then a feeling of like bravery, courage, and confidence arise with compassion, which is the antidote to that kind of hopeless or agitation. That was the only one. You mentioned a number of obstacles, but those various things. Eventually, if one gets to that level where compassion is conjoined with equanimity, wisdom, and confidence, then one doesn't have to worry. Like then one becomes free from all that problem.
It's like really hard. Like this morning in my car, don't ask me why because it takes too long to explain here. But I was thinking about if I ever meet like Joseph Kony, like I would tell him he's the head of the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda, and they've been murdering people for 20 some odd years. And I was thinking, whoa, if I ever see him, I would call him out to his face. Like I don't care if he'd like kill me dead right in front of him. I would just say, what I think about him to his face. Like I wouldn't care, for real. And then, but now I'm thinking like my attitude towards criminals, and I'm sure that this is true for many, many people, judging by the Yahoo comment boards especially, when we read about pedophiles, rapists, murderers, psychopaths, all these people, there's a tendency to have like less than compassion, like this hatred and animosity for them. And occasionally I do feel compassion. I feel like this person who killed 20 some odd people must be really mentally sick or have issues, And then I think about like Stockholm Syndrome is like another case where maybe what we call Stockholm Syndrome really is like changing is it really brainwashing, or did that person maybe, in some cases, maybe it's just brainwashing, but maybe in other cases, the person really did have sort of a different point of view, changing their point of view maybe towards their captors. So for those who don't know what I'm talking about, Stockholm Syndrome is like when you get kidnapped, and then like you sort of sympathize with your kidnappers eventually, right? So then, is sort of like the exercise we've been working on, where you try to see the other's point of view and think, oh yeah, maybe you're right. Not that kidnapping is good, but maybe like your political cause has some justification, or I feel bad for your suffering of your people or whatever. You know, I guess what I'm getting at is, if it's another distortion of reality, then it would be brainwashing. But if it's coming to see another's point of view for the reality in that point of view, then what we're calling Stockholm Syndrome wouldn't be. It would just be sort of this experiment that we've been working on. And the same thing about having compassion for killers and prisoners, right? So if all of a sudden, because like, you know, this is ruining my day now about, like, my thoughts about, you know, the head of the Lord's Resistance Army, because, like, you know, I don't wish him rainbows and happiness and unicorns. I'd like to see him off the face of the earth. But that's bad. That's a bad, you know, when I think about it from my perspective, that's wrong. From Buddhist perspective, it's wrong to wish death on people, even though they may be causing the death of millions. Not in the case of millions, but there are people like Hitler who literally
Because
the death of millions and millions.
well, to me, this gets actually maybe to me that's a good. It's a good that your question is a good. I don't know what it is. Way into something I wanted to talk about today anyway a little bit, which is just the first step on compassion, which is this equanimity. So maybe let's actually contemplate. I think that'll answer your question. So let's contemplate it for a few. I want to show how to contemplate, because to contemplate equanimity. People like that are the hardest ones, actually, right? So that's why I think it's a great way of getting into that, because those are the hardest people to have equanimity for, right? Like you know, mass murderers or pedophiles or criminal, you know, somebody who's done terrible things of any kind. And so, to me, it's a good transition. So, because like I said, right, the very first, if one wants to develop compassion, actually, and oftentimes we don't like this, actually. Like, in other words, I just think, my observation has been that people, actually, like, you know, nobody really says, I mean, well, actually there are people, but nobody who comes to Buddhist classes, right, says compassion's a bad thing, right? In other words, nobody, you know, people don't go, oh, I want to go to a class about meditation, I think compassion sucks, right? That doesn't, those don't go together. There are people who think compassion sucks, but they don't tend to go to Buddhist class. But actually, equanimity is a little like people don't like that as much, right? Because actually it's easier, it's more comfortable to have compassion for our friends, right? And our loved ones. That's a lot easier. And as you were getting at, right, it's hard sometimes to think about even compassion for our own enemies, and then of course for like bad people in the world. But actually, I want to start with this. Like, there are many, many, many actually contemplations in Buddhism on this point. But so I think it's useful to talk about a little bit. So remember again, though, that what we're getting at here is that, like, there are mainly two types of meditation. Right? I said this a little bit before another class. So one is concentration meditation, right, where you're concentrating on your breath, right, for example, or you're concentrating on a picture of a Buddha in your mind, or you're concentrating on some other mental object, let's say. Right? But then the second type of meditation is analytical meditation, right? And that's what you know. The Dalai Lama often emphasizes analytical meditation. Right? He says reason, right? Wherever the Dalai Lama goes, he's always talking about you know, the importance of reason, right? Of using reason and of engaging our reason in meditation. So that's analytical meditation, right? And what we were doing earlier about desire was a form of analytical meditation, right? Where you're using reason. In other words, you're looking at your own experience and then you're using reason to analyze it. So in these kinds of reason-based meditations, though, I want to be clear, like, just to make sure everybody gets it, that these are not intellectualized, though. That's not what Buddha, reason meditation is not intellectualization. It's not the same thing, right? It's like reason meditation is where you bring up that feeling of craving, for example, right? And then you analyze it from many angles until you realize it's a hallucination, it's a delusion, whatever, and then you let it go, right? That's a visceral experience, right? Because you're actually brought up something that's like a huge part of your daily life, and then you're using reason to kind of challenge it until your perception shifts and your experience shifts, right? So you see that reason, sometimes in the West we can confuse reason or contemplative meditation, especially meditation. We sort of think like, I think we in the West we get this idea of like, I don't know, of like some intellectual at a university in London or in England somewhere kind of sitting back and, that's not what Buddhism is getting at. What Buddhism is getting is you bring something up and then you analyze your own experience. Does that make sense? So this equanimity one should be the same. So that's why it's exactly what you're describing. In other words, actually, if you read the texts in Buddhism on equanimity, what you do is you actually bring to mind somebody like that. You see what I mean? Or so you actually, sometimes they'll have one where you bring to mind the person you're really grasping at, like person you're most attached to, and then you bring to mind, an evil dictator. And then you see, wow, my attitude is complete. Like, I hate this person, and I desperately want this one to be happy. I wish I could kill them, or something. Right? So you start with that, so you realize I don't have equanimity at all, and then you work with it. Does that make sense? And I want to say, too, just to answer, an equanimity or compassion even for bad people doesn't mean you approve of their behavior or you're trying to... In other words, it doesn't mean that you wouldn't stop them if you possibly could. These are two different things. One is behavioral, and the other is attitude, right? So the attitude is, I don't want to live my life with hatred or is that actually what Buddhism is saying is this, actually. So we'll start now, right? So you think of let's do that, right? If you bring to mind somebody you're attached to, and then somebody you think of as evil and bad, right? Actually, there are many easy ways to start, but one is, or just somebody you don't like, right? Actually, right, I mean, I'm just starting, this is even preliminary before we get to the typical meditation, is actually my feeling of dislike or of anger towards the person I don't like, right? Actually is the same as what they have, right? In other words, they're controlled by anger also oftentimes. So I think, wow, immediately start to feel a little uncomfortable to recognize that, actually, right? In other words, I'm a good person, they're not a good person, I'm saying, in my mind, right? But then if I'm feeling hatred or anger towards them, well, I'm kind of, in that moment, I'm being kind of like that. Right? And so one goes, oh, wow, that's is that how I want to motivate my existence, right? And so immediately it starts to make you a little uncomfortable because you just want to think, I'm good, they're bad, right? I'm good and my friend is good, but the enemy's bad, right? This is the polarity of non-equanimity, right? But so you start to analyze your own experience through reason, right? You have to say, that's true, actually. Whereas if I'm feeling anger or hatred towards my enemy, well, then I'm the enemy, actually, towards that, from their point of view. Whereas then I'm actually evil from their point of view, right? Because I hate them. And they would look at me and say, oh, this person hates me, and they'd be nervous or uncomfortable. And so one has to start with this is just realistic to go, oh, that's a little uncomfortable to feel, actually, right? That I think they're bad, and yet I'm being hateful to them. They don't even think about me, but I think about them with hatred, right? They may not know me, or if they do know me, maybe they don't hate me, but I'm hating them in that moment, right? And then when there's another one, right? Another contemplation, which is, this recognition, right? That we're all the same in wanting to be happy. This is the actual equanimity meditation, right? That actually, my friend, a stranger, and the worst enemy to me and myself, all four of us, are exactly equal deep down in our heart in wanting to be happy, and we're exactly the same in not wanting to suffer. Right? We may have different methods, actually. We may have different ideas about how to get happiness and how to avoid suffering, but the wish is the same, actually, right? Actually, even the worst, whether the person's been a wonderful person or a bad person, actually everybody wants to be happy. Right? Even that's not even unique to humans, right? You can see even animals want to be happy and don't want to suffer. Right? We're all the same. My point is that humans, animals, we're all the same in that way. So for sure, this person who I don't like wants to be happy and doesn't want to suffer. Right? And yet, all of us, right, the enemy, stranger, friend, and me, right? Actually we're all confused. So although we want to be happy and don't want to suffer, actually we all create suffering for ourselves and others sometimes. We all make mistakes. Also, we're all mortal. Right? So all of us are equal in that we're going to die eventually. So we're here, all of us are the same in the sense of we're born. We're here for like actually what's a fairly brief time. Right? Even 100 years is not terribly long. Almost nobody lives that long. And then we die, having wanted happiness, but having created suffering. Very rarely having found some pure happiness, if ever. And so you really try to feel, like if you think of the friend, right, the person you are attached to or grasp at, and then the enemy who you hate or dislike, and really try to feel how that wish for happiness, that wish to be free from sorrow, is the same. The methods are different, but the wish is the same. Actually, in that sense, everybody's exactly the same. There's no difference at all. We're the same in not being able to see things accurately. Right? That's why we all make mistakes. Also, right, I feel when I look at my friend that they're inherently a friend. But actually there are lots of people in the world who look at them and think negatively, right? Or they feel that person's an enemy. Actually, right? When they look at my friend, they think, oh, horrible. Right? So actually there's nothing from the side of the friend that makes them inherently a friend. It's just a temporary relational quality, right? And the same with the enemy, the person who I hate, right? Actually, there are people who look at them and feel like incredible cherishing of them. So it's not intrinsic. It feels like it's something intrinsic to their face, right? Like just that face that has something like intrinsically, it's hateful, right? It's terrible. Actually, it's not true. It's actually my mind constructing that. Because somebody else sees that face, right? Like that person's boyfriend or girlfriend or child or parent, right, or best friend, and they see that face and they feel a sense of joy. Right? So what feels like it's intrinsic to that face is actually my projection. It's not there from its own side. Right? It's my mind that is labeling them horrible and labeling this one good. And then one more contemplation on this that's actually, again, very valid and true, is also like, not only does somebody else at this time, like I see them as good or bad and somebody else sees them the opposite, but actually if I'm honest with myself, my projections change over time. Right? Whereas if we look, I myself and others like me, right? If you look over the course of time, right, then people who we thought were so wonderful, later we can't stand. Right? And people who we thought were horrible or bad, then later are our friends. Right? And this is true like on an individual level, right? If you look in society, right, like you look at if you see a couple on their wedding day and then a couple on the day they are in divorce court, right? Then for sure that's true. Right? Like in other words, one day people could look at somebody and say, "Oh my God, they're the most beautiful thing in the world. I can't live without them." Then another day they can't wait to like never see their face again. Same on political level, right? With like our national like friends and enemies, right? There was a time when like right, we can say for sure, right? There was a time when the British seemed like the worst enemies to the American point of view. Said, "Oh, the British are terrible." Now the British are the best ally. British and Americans are the best allies, right? There was a time when the American government, like, was for sure, everybody knows this, right? Everybody knows that there was a time when the members of the Taliban were considered a great friend of the United States, right? And then things change one way and the other, and back and forth, right? And that's just the nature of relationships. In other words, that's what Buddhism's saying, right? Is that we project, right? If somebody's meeting our needs, right, like whether it's on the wedding day or whether it's the Taliban in the United States or whether it's Britain, like when somebody's meeting our needs and doing what we want, then we say, "Oh, they're our best friend. I can't live without them." Then when somebody's like doing what we don't like, then we say, oh, they're terrible, and we label them bad, right? But it's just based on temporary behaviors, right? So if the person started acting differently, then there could come a time where we thought, oh, they're the most important ally, or most important friend, or most important loved one, Then if they change their behavior, then we don't like them. Right? It's actually in a way it's childish, it's also temporary, and it's not seeing the long-term perspective. And Buddhism actually asserts that over the course of many lifetimes, actually, then this is even more radical. We see it in this life, right, with political and, right, but actually if you go across lifetimes, then it's even more so, that actually your worst enemy becomes your best friend, and so on. You can actually see it in this life, so you don't even need to think about future lives and past lives. But even in this life, right, it's so true. Actually. Can you remember, a time, think of your most cherished friend, right? And can you remember a time when they were a stranger? Like when you saw their face and you thought nothing, actually, they were nobody to you, right? Actually they walked by, they may have walked right by you and you would have had no feeling at all. Then they become like a cherished person. And then for sure, if there are things they could do where then you would not want to see them anymore, right? You would think they're terrible. And the same goes for the worst enemy, for sure. 100% for sure, right? Your worst enemy could become, somebody you really hate or think is terrible, then for sure they could become somebody very cherished. And they already are somebody cherished to somebody else. It's just from my perspective, they're not. But then if they change their behavior, then I could feel like I can't, they're totally necessary to me. And so the point is you contemplate like that until you develop a feeling of, so first you give rise to that exaggerated feeling, right? This one's so great. From their own side, they're so valuable. This one, from their own side, they're terrible, right? And then through all these different many reasonings, there are more, but let's just use those, you go through various reasonings until you reach the point where you actually feel, oh wow, it's a little silly actually. First you start to feel it's silly how that way of viewing that it's from their own side, you start to feel that's just silly, actually. And then eventually you start to feel, that everybody wants to be happy. Nobody wants to suffer, and that everybody is worthy of being cherished or is precious in some sense. Right? Just if I think I am, then for sure they are too. If I assert that, especially if I look at some young child and I feel this child is worthy of being cherished, then for sure this person is worthy of being cherished too. Because it's just, if I feel a cat or dog is worthy of being cherished, then everybody's the same. Whereas that everybody's worthy of being cherished, everybody's precious, everybody wants to be happy, nobody wants to suffer. Right? It's a realistic view actually, is the point. And if you keep contemplating that way, eventually your attitude starts to shift. It doesn't happen if you're doing it once. But if you do that over and over again, then your attitude starts to shift so that you start to feel a sense of, yes, there are these temporary changes. It's not denying that. There's somebody treats you a certain way, well then, they're not acting like your friend. Nobody's denying that. But that's a temporary projection. From their own side, they're no less precious, actually. From their own side, they're no less wanting happiness. From their own side, they're no less suffering and wanting to be free from suffering. And actually, in a way, you could keep doing that until you get that feeling in meditation, right? Just once, you get it. Then if you do it over and over again, that feeling becomes familiar. Actually, that's what meditation is, just familiarization with a state like that. I mean, we said, the Tibetan for meditation, right, is familiarization. Gom means familiarizing with a virtuous state of mind, right? So this sense of, and virtuous in this sense also means accurate, reasonable, realistic. So if you develop that realistic view, right, that everybody's equal and wanting to be happy, not wanting to suffer, and then you familiarize with that, that's perfect meditation, actually. Actually, so the Dalai Lama often says, he talks about for world peace, right, that what's essential is inner disarmament, right? Because we have to disarm ourselves. Stop being, which means not having hatred, right? Or is that as long as people have hatred, actually as long as people have hatred, there will be war, right? Because hatred is an expression. War is an expression of hatred. Actually, so actually this kind of meditation on equanimity, actually is, since we are among the people, right, who are on this planet, then if we want to create peace on this planet, actually that's the meditation to do. Really. That's the meditation for inner disarmament, isn't it? So as we stop, because actually, there is, whether it's in a family or whether it's between nations or whether it's at a workplace, right? I'm using, then if it's a workplace, it's not literally a war, but it can sometimes, people say that, right? Oh, I'm going to war with this person, right? It means like I'm on this side, they're on that side, and I'm going to try to mess them up, right? I'm going to try to hurt their position in order to promote my own, right? Whether that's in a family, same thing happens, right? And then between nations, of course it happens, right? But if we want to change that, actually, this is the meditation for it. Actually, it's fun. I think this is funny. They say actually that this meditation is also, they call it a meditation on nonviolence. And in Buddhism, what they say actually is they say, so you, right, from a Buddhist point of view, you don't die, there's reincarnation, right? So actually what Buddhism says is if you don't do this kind of meditation, then in some future life, actually you will be those people. You see what I mean? Like, whereas if you don't develop equanimity, and if you like your friends and hate your enemies, then someday, in some future life, you don't become, in other words, if you don't develop equanimity and become enlightened, someday you'll be a dictator. Someday you'll be right, because it's the mind. How does somebody become that? Is they want, they think they're right and others are wrong. They think I should be powerful and that my enemy should be crushed, and so on. And if you have that mindset, over infinite amounts of time, you'll eventually become everything. So, and already have been, actually, from a Buddhist point of view. You've been the worst things in the world and the best things in the world. You've been, and so the point there is that actually Buddhism says, if you do this meditation, at least you're stopping yourself from hurting people. In this life, you'll be a little less likely to try to hurt your coworker or your family member who annoys you. And in future lives, if you get when you're born with some power in a particular way, you won't use it to hurt people. Because you'll have developed a mind that actually, even when somebody harms you, you don't think they're inherently your enemy and therefore you wish to kill them. Right? That you recognize, okay, they're harming me, I don't like that. But actually they're not evil nobody's evil from their own side inherently, right? People develop in a certain way and can end up being very bad. But the Buddhist view is, I've been that too. Right? And they're not always going to be that. And actually sometimes from their perspective, I'm that. And so on. And it's not, again, the view here, the goal here is not to accept negative behavior of others or promote, it's not that. One can have ethical standards, but it's an attitude thing of not having hatred. Does that make sense? It's saying that I can do anything to, maybe with certain things I would do anything. I would give my life to stop something. And even be aggressive to stop something, but not with hatred, actually. That's the difference. And Buddhism saying that any action with hatred, remember that quote earlier from Nagarjuna that I quoted to you, any action done with hatred is a cause of suffering. An action done free from hatred and craving and ignorance is not a cause of suffering.
Okay, in Tuesday night's class, we were talking about, I asked a question about self-defense, and so I guess the answer I was given is like Buddhism, you should not cherish your body so much to the point where you're so attached to it that like you would kill another in order to save your body, because then it's like you are putting yourself over the other person. But now you were just mentioning that sometimes aggression can be okay if it's not done with hatred. So can you speak to that point? Because I mean, maybe we were looking at it in an oversimplified way, or maybe there's just carte blanche, like never kill, it's always wrong and there's no exceptions to any of it. Because I had asked, like, what about if somebody's coming to my house to do horrible things to my family and like torture and kill them and bad things? Like, I know my inclination, and most people's inclination, would be an act of protecting others, and not just my family. I would extend that even to strangers.
I'll tell a story. There's a traditional story that was told to respond
And
to
I
that.
asked about soldiers and police officers too. Like if they are protecting others, so then are they like wrong to And if they're doing it without malice, then
Yeah, that's the key, really. Is like, so in Buddhism, for sure, right? Like that quote from the Nagarjuna, any action done with hatred is a cause of suffering. So there's no doubt about that. Whereas from a Buddhist point of view, if you do something out of hatred, that's a negative action, for sure. But there's a traditional story told, actually the Buddha told this story. The Buddha said this story that in a previous life, the Buddha told many stories of his own previous lifetimes. And so the Buddha told the story that in a previous life he was a sailor on a ship, like a sailing ship, like a trade ship, where he was traveling to buy and sell goods. And the captain of that ship had, so they had sailed somewhere and gotten their goods, and then they were coming back to their own home port to sell the goods. And this ship's captain decided to kill all of his employees. I think his idea was that they would get I'm not sure, but I think his idea was that they would get a percentage of the sales. So if he killed them all, then he could just keep all the profit. Because he was already coming back to his own place, so he could get he figured he didn't need them anymore, so he could kill them and then get the profit. So I think it was something like that. I'm not sure if that was his reason, but something like that, I think. But anyway, so the future Buddha, right? They call him the Bodhisattva. At that time, he was not yet a Buddha. So the Bodhisattva learned of the captain's plan. Right? So he knew that he was going to. So he was on the ship, and he knew that this captain was going to kill not just him, but all the other sailors, right? And so, so they say actually that the Buddha, the future Buddha, the Bodhisattva, looked at the situation, and he thought if he does that, right, if he kills all these people, then of course, first of all these people will be dead. That's a huge loss, right, for their families and so on, and for themselves. But then also he thought this captain, right, he had compassion for the captain. He thought if he does that, actually, what a huge negative karma. In other words, he's actually motivated by greed, and he's going to create so much future suffering for himself. And then he thought, I can't convince him not to do this. He knew that he wasn't able to convince this captain. So then he thought, well, out of compassion for the other sailors, but also particularly compassion for the captain himself, my only option is to kill him before he kills everybody else. And then the Buddha he knew about karma. And so the Buddha thought, he was not yet a Buddha though, and he thought to himself, he said, well, even if I have to go to a hell realm for killing, that's fine. He won't have this heavy karmic debt of having killed so many people. All these other people will be alive. So I'm happy to take the loss on myself and let all these other sailors live and let the captain not create this negative karma. And so he said, so I'll take that on myself, the loss, and I'll give them the opportunity for benefit. And so with that motivation, he went and killed the ship's captain. And it's said actually that because his motivation was compassion, that actually exchanged self for others. In his mind, he thought, even if I go to hell, it's okay, because I'm doing this for others. They say that the Buddha said actually that speeded his path to enlightenment because of the purity of his. There was that he did this action with such a pure motivation that he actually became enlightened more quickly through having done that. Even though he killed, which was in general a negative action, he actually became enlightened more quickly because it was motivated not by hatred but by compassion. In that case, including compassion for the person he killed. In that case, so definitely there are what's the word? Exceptions, I guess. Like that would be an exception, right? But the issue is, but there's no exception to that hatred is a cause of suffering. That there's no exception. But in terms of behavioral action, then it's mainly the motivation is what determines it.
So, in a very basic sense, if someone breaks into your house, I mean, obviously you would not intentionally maybe try to. I probably would, but most people, from a Buddhist perspective, we shouldn't probably try to kill them. But what if the only particular way to stop them, or let's take an example of a bear charging at you. Maybe in order to stop the bear, wounding wouldn't be enough. You'd have to kill the bear. So, what do? Do you allow the bear to devour you or the other people and, stretch the
Let me tell
out of them? Or
I'll tell one more short story and then I'll answer. Then I'll give a final answer and we have to stop. But I'll give one last. So there's another story in the Buddha's previous life. that's actually told in the Sutra of Golden Light, beautiful sutra, right? Where there's a famous story, right? That the Buddha he was a prince and he was with his two brothers and they were walking through a forest, and he came across, this is a famous story, right? He came across the tigress and her, I think it was 4 cubs, and the tigress was starving to death because she had given birth but then didn't have the strength to go hunt. And so the cubs were dying and the tigress was dying, and the future Buddha, right, he was with his two brothers. And then they left. They saw the tigress and they walked away. And then he said, "Oh, I'll catch up with you. I have to do something." To his brothers. He said, "But I have to do something now." And then he went back and he gave his life to the tigress. Right? He fed himself to the tigress, thereby saving the tigress and her 4 cubs. And as he did that, he said, this is funny. In Buddhism, they say there's a warning, like we do on TV, like they do warnings or something like. So in Buddhism, there's a warning. It doesn't say this in the story, but the Buddhist teachers who teach on it give a warning. They say, don't try this until you're at least on the first bhumi, bodhisattva. It's a certain level of practitioner. So don't try this at home unless you're at that level. Anyway, so the future Buddha, as he did this, he said to himself, what he said out loud actually was, he said, I've been training on the bodhisattva path. He could already remember his past lives and could see future lives. He was a very advanced spiritual being at that point. But he actually said, I'm trying to complete the perfection of generosity. It's one of the 6 perfections. He said, and to complete that perfection, you have to be able to give your body, even your eyeballs and your ear. You have to be able to give away everything. And he said, I've been looking for an opportunity to complete, to practice, to progress in my practice of generosity. He said, finally, I found it. Here is somebody who needs a body. I feel so fortunate. I can now make progress on my. And he already knew in his future life he would be. He could see that by dying in that way, he would receive another good life and would continue his spiritual practice, and that this was a chance to progress on a spiritual path, and this was the time for that. And so he happily gave his body, and the tigress was okay, and the 4 cubs they became his first. Was it 4 or 5? I forget now. Anyway, they became his first disciples when he was a Buddha. In other words, that was his prayer. He said, "May I give you my body now, and in the future, I'll guide you to enlightenment." And through that karma of the intimacy of that generosity, they became his disciples. All of them became his disciples when he was later a Buddha, and achieved arhatship and so on. So that's a different. So my point there is that my point in sharing those 2 opposite stories, like one he killed somebody to protect, another he gave his own. He killed himself to save them. Is again, like, it goes back to what we were doing earlier. That I think in Buddhism there's not really a formulaic answer, that one has to judge for oneself honestly and with integrity, what's my level? What am I capable of? What, in this circumstance, what can I do that expresses compassion and some wisdom and is appropriate to the situation? I think we're supposed to stop it. So that's my answer to that question. Anyway, it doesn't give it. There's not a formulaic answer. It's my answer, but that those are 2 like kind of stories that get at the tension of the complexity of how to practice. I think those are extremes, obviously, but in our life we have smaller examples that I think get at those same points, which is there's not a formulaic answer, but it takes a lot of honesty with oneself. So anyway, I'll just say, we mainly covered the first of the 4 parties of attachment. We actually only covered the first, but that's okay. That's good. And so, but actually, I want to say one other thing too. So, actually, if you look at those parting from the 4 attachments, though, so next week, right, Venerable George Chernoff, who's an amazing monk and teacher, is going to teach Death and Rebirth, which actually covers the first of the parting from attachments in a different way. And then after that, if we go further into Discovering Buddhism, the next module is Samsara and Nirvana, which I think probably I'll be teaching unless George stays longer, but I think I'll be teaching most likely. So that's actually the second of the parting from attachments from Samsara. After that comes the class on Bodhicitta, which is the third of the 4 attachments. Attachment to your own selfishness in order to live with compassion. And I think the class after that, there's one more in between, Transforming Problems, but then the next one after that is Emptiness, which is the last. So actually, if you look at Discovering, the upcoming Discovering Buddhism modules cover the parting from attachments in great detail, is my point. So they'll be covered over the course of the rest of this year. So since we didn't get to the others, it's okay because they'll all be covered in Discovering Buddhism. But okay, we always end with this, so let's end by dedicating merit, right? So Buddhist view is if you create a little bit of positive energy, good karma, wisdom, positive virtue, then it's good to dedicate that energy for the future. So any merit, any virtue we've created, so it's dedicated so that we eat, first of all, that each of us here will continue to have more peace of mind, to be more free, more and more free from grasping or craving attachment, from anger or hatred, from ignorant delusion. Therefore, not creating suffering and causes of suffering, instead creating happiness and causes of happiness, so that we live happy lives. And then that we may help others around us, and more generally, to have more peace, peace in their mind, peace in relationships, peace between nations. So through this, right, may all beings actually be free from hatred, anger, craving, delusion. May all beings be free from suffering and its causes. May all beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May there be peace, no conflict between families, no conflict between groups, no conflicts and wars between nations. Instead, may there be peace on all those levels. So inner peace and outer peace. And also may the Dharma teachings that share wisdom last long and benefit beings. And may we continue to progress along the spiritual path characterized by compassion and wisdom. May we ultimately progress, all of us, to full enlightenment in order to be of ultimate benefit to all sentient beings, as vast as the vastness of space. Perfectly guiding and helping others so as to lead all beings on a path of wisdom and compassion to enlightenment.